What's going on, guys? My name is Mike Sabo, and today we're going to build this 2003 Suzuki LTZ400 engine. Now, this is going to apply to the KFX400 engine, that's a Kawasaki engine, also the DVX400 engine, that's the Arctic Cat version. They're all the same. I believe they were all produced by Suzuki. They're all identical. The other thing is, you've got years 2003 to 2008 for the Z400, and I believe it will also apply to the fuel-injected version, which is 2009 to 2014, but don't quote me on that. I think the engines are the same, though. For the KFX400, I believe it's 2003 to 2006, and for the DVX400, I think it's 2004 to 2008. So any of those model years, it will work. It's also very similar to the motorcycle version. So you have the DRZ400, they've got the DRZ400 SM, which was the street model, and there's a number of other DRZ400 variations. It's not the exact same motor, but there's going to be a lot of shared components, especially the top end. So if you have one of those, this video could help you out with those engine builds as well. Now, throughout this video, I will be referring to two separate manuals. I've got the Suzuki service manual, that is the OEM service manual, and I will also be referring to the Climber service manual. I know mine has seen better days, but it's still got all the good information in it. Now, as far as the video goes, for references, in the top right corner of the video, I will have the section of the service manual that you can refer to so that you can follow along with the engine build. I will be using the Climber manual for that one because I feel like that's the one that most people are going to have. Now, if you don't have a manual, that's absolutely fine. That's what this video is for. The video should be able to get you all the way through your engine build from start to finish, but I do like to make this disclaimer that these videos are for reference only. I'm not a certified technician. I didn't go to a trade school or anything like that. I've been working with and building engines pretty much my whole life since I was a kid. It's probably been close to 20 years now. But I've gotten pretty dang good at it, so hopefully this video can help you get through your engine build as well, because going through these service manuals can be pretty confusing if you don't know what you're doing. Any special tools or fluids and chemicals that are used in the video will be linked in the description below. There's also going to be chapters in the description below, so if you want to jump to any certain point in the video, that will all be in the description. There's going to be a number of stuff that I repeat in this video because I understand that there's a lot of people that they're not going to watch the video from start to finish. They're going to jump ahead to whatever section they need help on. So we're going to jump back in time to when this engine was torn down to 1,000 pieces. But before we do that, I did want to mention that there is an entire build series on this engine. This is a 2003 engine. It was from a 2003 Z400. It was an absolute wreck when I got it. Did a full restoration on it. There is a total build series. You can see it refixed from beginning all the way to finish. It's an awesome series, and I highly recommend you check it out. And one last thing before we get started, if this video helps you out in any way, shape, or form, please give me a thumbs up. That helps me out tremendously. And also consider subscribing to the YouTube channel. And if you do stay till the end of the video, you will get to see this engine running. All right, let's hop back in time and build this thing. The first thing we're going to do are the center cases. Now, there's a couple things I want to go over before we begin. I've already loaded all brand new bearings into these cases, and I've got brand new seals, and I have the seal retainers installed. The other thing that I put in is the clutch actuator. There's a little rod that goes down in here, and there are two bearings. There's one at the top, and there's a tiny one at the bottom. Chances are, when you're doing your engine, this isn't even going to be removed. It's rare that those bearings go bad. If you do have to pull this out, you can put the actuation arm on top of this and then just get a puller and tap this out, and it'll pull the bearing out with it. It's very easy to do. It seems kind of daunting when you're looking at it, but it comes out pretty easily. There's basically a little plate that goes on top and this screw. You just pop that off, and like I said, you tap on it, it'll pull it out. The bottom bearing probably isn't bad either. To get that out, you'll need a special puller. I wouldn't worry about it. We've also got a plate up here with two screws. I would use a blue Loctite on these. If you go by the Suzuki service manual, they want you to use a red. So you could use just a very, very small amount of red or a blue. Either one of them, you're going to be fine. Over here, there is a seal in place underneath this retainer. There are screws on the bottom and the top. Again, I would use a blue Loctite on those. If we flip around to the back, we've got another plate that goes right here. And again, most of this stuff, when you disassemble an engine and put it back together, you're not even taking these off. But just in case you're working with a basket case or something, I want to point out where all this stuff goes. And then again, there is a screw that goes in the top and a screw that goes in the bottom. I believe these are M6 by 12. And again, I would use a blue Loctite or just a very small dab of red Loctite on those. In here, you've got a shielded bearing. It's shielded on the other side. The inside is not shielded. We've got your transmission bearing right here, and then this is where the shift drum goes. You've got a special bearing right here, and you will notice these are repaired cases, so yours probably won't have a repair like that, but it's not going to affect any of the assembly. Now, for the other case half, we have a couple really important things here. One is you've got your studs. Again, probably something that is not going to be touched, but if you have bad studs, they can be replaced. Right here is probably the most important thing. This is, I believe it's for the idler gear. So it's a small shaft with a circlip on it, and if that is removed, you cannot get it on once you put the center cases together. So in order to put that in, this is the back side of it. It has to come through the side from the center cases. So you need to make sure that that's in place before you build your center cases, okay? I can't stress that enough. So again, but likely that will not even have ever been removed, but I did want to point that out. Then you've got a pin over here for the shift shaft. That is removable as well. You want to make sure that that's in place. Let's flip around the other side here. Then we've got our counterbalancer bearing, crank bearing, over here our transmission bearings, and down here for our shift drum. The one retainer is right here. It's one piece. You've got these flathead screws that go in place here. Again, a dab of red Loctite or use medium blue. And same thing with these retainers right here. These do have this type of screw. One of the first things I want to do is put our oil screen in place. Make sure this is good and clean. It's not filled with contaminants or anything like that. You will see in the front there is a part number. That is going to face upward, and it's going to go right like so. There is no gasket or anything like that, and the service manual does not say this, but I'm putting a little bit of low strength Loctite on these. You could use probably like a blue if you're not using the Suzuki brand. We'll get these threaded in place. This is one of those pieces you don't want to forget because it is in the center cases. So if you get your engine together and you see this sitting on the bench, you're going to have to take everything apart again. Or just not run the oil screen, which I'm sure some people would do. Now, I had trouble finding in the Suzuki service manual what the torque is for this. They say the general torque specification is 4 for these M6 bolts. I think that's a little light. I'm going to torque these to 6 foot-pounds. Now we're going to flip around to the other side. We've got 2 oil pipes that go in place. They both have O-rings. You can see this one's got 2. This one's got 2 also. I did replace these. Just make sure they're in good condition, and ideally, if you can, definitely a good idea to replace them. We're going to put a little bit of lubricant on these. Don't want them to be dry. Just a little bit. And this will pop in place up here. Just be gentle with it. It will pop in place. Okay, and then there's this one up here. Again, make sure you've got some lubricant on those O-rings, and it will just pop in place like so. You just press on that until it bottoms out. And then one last thing, if we come up top, there's a little hole right here. We've got an oil jet that goes there. There is an O-ring on it. Again, should be replaced. Probably can get away with it. If it's not, I think this could be another one of those things that a lot of people just don't remove. But there's no threads or anything. It literally just pops in place. And one last thing before we move forward, you want to make sure all of your seals have grease on the inner lip and all of your bearings are lubricated. So I've already gone over all of mine and put a light layer of lubrication on all of my bearings, and all of my seals have a little bit of grease on the inner seals. That's really important to do. Whether you do it right at the beginning or as you're building it, just make sure you put grease on there and you have oil on your bearings and other components. And we will lubricate some of this stuff together as we're building the engine today. And I believe that is it for making sure your center cases are good and prepared. These are not new cases. Obviously, they have that weld on there. If you're wondering why they look like they're brand new, these are vapor blasted by Motoblast. That is njvaporblast.com. You can hit them up and send them pretty much any engine cases. These are the original cases from 2003, man, and they were super cruddy. He can make anything look brand new. All right, let's go ahead and install the crank. All right, now we're going to install the crank. We're going to do it on the left side case half. You will need a crank installer tool to put this in. I'm using one made by Tusk. You can get these on Rocky Mountain ATV. I will have that linked in the description below. Here is our crank. Before you put this in place, one thing I would recommend doing is making sure that the dowel pins and the keys are removed. So you can see there's a little hole there. That's for this pin. They can get hung up on the inner race of the bearing, and you can be, trying to pull this thing in and can't figure out why. So just make sure that that's not in there, and also that the keys are not in either side of your crank. Before you go installing it, we're going to do the tapered side first. So that is the side with the smaller threads, and you can see the tapered section here. That is for the flywheel. Here's what the other end looks like. So this is the end that'll be going in, and again, this is the left side case half. We're going to go ahead. You can put this in the freezer if you want, and then heat up the inner race of your bearing with like a torch. That will make it so that sometimes it just drops right in place and you don't even need a puller. I just like to pull them right through. So we'll get this in place. You want to make sure that your connecting rod at all times is facing upward, at least when you're pulling it through, because as you go in, it'll actually get stuck up against the case if it's down here. You want to make sure it's going through the hole up at the top. We're just going to stack this up on some 2x4s. A lot of people are like, oh man, you should use an engine stand. And if you have one of those, that's great too. That can help you out a lot, but I know a lot of people don't have those. So we're going to do it garage style and use some 2x4s. We could probably use about one more. All right, that should do it. All right, now using the crank installer is easy. We've got a sleeve that goes over, and then a threaded portion. The kits that you buy, like this Tusk one, usually come with a couple adapters so that you can do several different styles of cranks. And then this will slide over and thread in place. And now we're attached to the crank. Now this will slide over. You'll notice on the inside there's a little notch. It's got like a keyed portion. That is going to line up with a little pin on the other piece. This will slide over. Get it lined up. There we go. Let that drop in place. There is a nut that will thread on top. We're just going to get this started. And then these two bars will lift up and go underneath like so. And however you have these, you want to make sure that they're on sturdy portions of the case. Sometimes there's a cutout for your grommet for your stator. You don't want to do it there. And if you can, put it where the thicker portions are. Sometimes you can't. You have to use a thinner portion. But you just want to try to make sure that you're evenly placing the pressure points, if at all possible, and that you're not, again, in any like grooves or anything. You don't want to break the cases. Throw a wrench on, and this is going to pull the crank right through. You should see it pulling right up into that crank bearing. Oh, almost forgot. You want to make sure that the rod is coming out into the opening. I literally almost just made that mistake right after getting done telling you guys not to do that. So just make sure, and sometimes as you're spinning this, the crank will spin. So just make sure it's in the right spot. And this one's going in nice and easy. And we'll just pull this until it bottoms out. Sometimes you'll hear like creaking and cracking sounds. That's totally normal, unless it's like super violent. But it should come through nice and straight, especially if you have it up on these blocks. Sometimes when you're doing it on an angle on the bench, the crank won't want to come through straight, and you have to do it over again. So, all right, I think we are bottomed out. That's what she said. Now to get this off, it's just the reverse method. I'm just going to loosen this nut off. This will slide off, get our bars out of here, unthread this, unthread this, and boom, crank is installed. And throughout the whole build, it's always a good idea to make sure that everything is moving nice and smoothly. That way, if you do have an issue and something is bound up, you can stop right then and there before you go any further and correct the issue. All right, now we can move into the transmission. Before the transmission, we'll put our counterbalancer in place. Again, make sure that you don't have the little pin that goes in right here. Make sure that's not in there, because if the pin's in there, the other side, the other case half will not fit in place. I actually had that issue getting the engine apart. It gets hung up on the inner race of the bearing. So we're going to roll the crank so that we can get the counterbalancer in here. It literally just pops in place like that. And if it hits, it's okay. This will be timed so that it doesn't hit when the engine's running. Okay, that's all you have to do. Just pop that in place. Now I'm going to try to do this in a way that you guys can see what's going on, but it can kind of be difficult, you know, getting my big fat hands in here and everything and still letting you guys see. So we're going to start with the reverse idle gear shaft right here. You can see there is a clip on there. If that's not on there, you want to make sure that that's in place. It goes into a little groove. We're going to place it with the clip facing more towards the top. So this will pop in place right here. Now we're going to put our counter shaft and our half shaft in. I am not going to show the breakdown and assembly of these. If you want to see how they go, there are schematics in the manual, and you can find schematics online at partzilla.com. It shows where all of the shims and clips go. It's really not that difficult. If you've got the climber like this, they really walk you through it, and they've got schematics that show exactly how to go. If your transmission is already together, you can, just by looking at the transmission, you can identify where the clips and the washers are and just make sure that everything's okay. You also want to visually inspect the transmission, make sure that the dogs, those square portions, don't have rounded or chipped edges, and also, of course, just checking to make sure that all the teeth on your gear, or all your gears, are good to go. Your counter shaft is good. You don't have like a snapped off bolt in there or messed up splines. Now's the time to address it, man. You don't want to get the engine together and then later on, you know, you have transmission problems. So we're going to start by removing this washer, this gear. There's a sleeve in here and another washer. We're just going to take that off for now. And then on our main shaft, this portion will be facing downward, and there's a washer that's going to be really difficult to keep on the end here. So a technique to keep that on there, we're going to take a little bit of our Suzuki super grease. Whatever kind of grease you're using will work, but this super grease is awesome because it's really tacky. And for this, it's perfect. We're just going to put a little bit on the shaft and then put our washer down on there. And now you don't have to worry about that washer falling off, man. It's going to stay in place. And we're going to do our best to mesh these together nice and tight. The counter shaft with the splines is going to go into our big bearing, and then that bearing, or the shaft that we just greased, is going to go into that bearing to the right. Now I'm going to try to do this here like I said so you guys can see. I'm basically just curling my one finger around the one gear at the bottom so it doesn't fall off, but it's easier said than done. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay, there we go. Now we're in place. Just roll this, make sure everything moves nice and smoothly. And I believe we're in. Now we're going to put the reverse idle gear on the idle gear shaft. We've got a washer that's going to go right up against that clip. Now we've got a bushing with a little oil hole in it that can get placed in any orientation. Then we've got the gear. The gear has a portion like this that is sunken, and the other side is like this. So we're going to take this portion and face it downward. Just mesh it in with our transmission. Then we've got a wave washer. I'm going to hang this like so. Another washer that goes on top. Next we're going to do our shift forks. The first thing we're going to do is take this spring, and it's going to go right in this hole right here. This is where one of our shift shafts are going to go. We'll pop in place right there. You can see, dropped right in there. We're going to go with our number 3 shift shaft now, or shift fork. So these are all numbered. You can see, it says right on there, 3B. So we want to make sure that this little pin here is facing towards where the shift drum is going to go. This is the shift drum right here. The shift drum is going to go in this bearing right here. So this pin will want facing towards that. and make sure there's some lubricant on these shift forks. We're going to put this in place. There's a groove for it. It can only go in one spot, so you can't really mess it up. We're going to put that there and then slide it to the side like so and just leave that in place. Now we can take the shift drum. You want to make sure that all of these channels are lubricated before you put it in, and you'll see there's a longer portion and a shorter portion. The longer portion is going to face downward into our bearing. We're just going to drop this in place like so. Now we have our other side for the shift forks. These are numbered as well. You can see we've got 1B and 2B. We're going to start with 2B. Make sure this is lubricated. Pin is going to face the shift drum, and this is going to slide down here where it needs to go. And again, it can be kind of difficult to see. Just take your time. It can only fit in one spot. And we're going to use the shift shaft actually as a tool. It helps to pick that up and kind of get it in the groove that it needs to go. And now we're going to take that pin and we can, sometimes you got to work this, you got to lift it up and get it into the groove. And I think I got it in there. All right. So that one's good. Now we're going to take, this should be 1B. And we're going to pop this one up here. This one's really easy because it's up top. And you can lift up the gear, get it into the groove. Now we'll take our shift shaft, make sure it's lubricated. Put this through, line up both of our forks, and then it lines up with a hole in the case. That one's good to go. Now if you guys can see this pin right here on the number 3 shift fork, we have to get that one in place as well. I'm going to use the shift shaft here. Try to guide it. It has to lift up a little bit. There we go. And then boom, popped right into the shift cam. And then we have the shift shaft. Same thing. You want to make sure this is lubricated. And it's going to go with the thinner portion facing down. And then up top, it's got this, it's like a guard up here. That's going to be upwards. This will go like so. Line that up with the case. It should pop right through. Then there's a little stopper up here, and you can see it's got a little bit of tension from that spring. That's the reverse lockout. Okay, that is good to go. Last thing we have is first gear. We've got a washer that goes in place like so. Then an oil ring. That'll go in place also. They want you to line this little hole up with the hole in the shaft, but it spins. I don't know how necessary that is to do, but we'll do it. Okay, that's lined up. Then we've got the gear itself. You want to face it with the dogs inward. And then there's one more washer, goes on top. Now's a good time to make sure that the transmission rolls freely. Ours is looking good. All right, we're going to go ahead and put our case sealer on and then put the 2 case halves together. We're going to be using Suzuki X-Star. This is their 1207B silicone gasket. This is what the OEM service manual recommends. You can use Yamabond, Honda Bond, any kind of equivalent sealant, but we're going to be using the Suzuki. The first thing that's really important is making sure that the mating surfaces are good and clean. Otherwise, the gasket sealer might not work right. So I'm using a little bit of lacquer thinner on a rag. My cases are already really clean, but if you get oil or something on there as you're putting the transmission and stuff in, that can mess it up. So it's a good idea to just go around and wipe it down, make sure that it's all clean. And we're going to be doing both sides before we put the cases together. So just make sure that both halves are good and clean. Before you even start, you want to make sure you have your dowel pins and your case bolts ready to go, because once you start putting this stuff on, time is the element. You know, I've gotten away with Yamabond. I've gotten away with, you know, even like 45 minutes before it cures. So you do have some time, but ideally you want to get this done within 15 minutes. So we're going to pop off the top here. Pop off the top. And I'm going to put this on same way I always do. Just going to kind of go ahead and spread it around the cases. And after it's been evenly distributed for the most part. The technique that I do, I just dab it like this. That kind of gives the cases, or the silicone, some body. And you want to try to make it nice and even all the way around the mating surfaces. And I'm going to be getting in here as well. Any places where the cases contact, we're going to get some sealant on it. And again, we're going to do both halves. And it's okay if you get a little bit on the inside of the engine or on the gears or the components. It's not going to hurt anything, but you do want to try to, keep it under control a little bit. Okay, our sealant's on there. Let's go ahead and put our dowel pins in place. This is a good time to put some anti-seize on them. That way, when it comes time to tear it down again, which will hopefully be never, because we're doing such an awesome job building it, it will make it much easier to remove these. Pop these in place. There's one that goes in the back, and there is one that goes in the front. Good. All right, now I'm going to do my best here not to touch any sealant while doing this. Kind of using the where the cam chain goes as like a handle. And we'll just line this up and drop it in place. Hoping this goes on better than it came off, because it didn't come apart that easy. I'm just trying not to touch any of the sealant, because that stuff will get all over. And this is when you just want to take your time, make sure everything is lined up. And it is possible we might have to use the crank puller on this side too. Now this is a reverse thread, so I actually had to make a tool for this. But Suzuki may sell one. But we're going to thread this on in reverse and pull this side through just like we did with the other side. All right. And that's what it was. It was just a little bit tight on that crank bearing, but it looks like we're good to go now. And it is okay to tap around with a mallet, a dead blow, just to make sure it's going on nice and smooth. And this is a regular dead blow. I just have painter's tape on there because it was dirty, and I don't want to dirty up our fresh cases. It looks like we're just about 100% seated. I think we're good. All right. Let's lock these cases down. I've got the hardware laid out right here. Now there's two ways of figuring out where they go. The one way is to just literally take the bolts and drop them in and make sure they all stick out an equal amount. And then you typically have them in the right spot. Or if you use the Partzilla website, Suzuki has a really nice layout. You can see they're numbered 3 and 4, and they have the sides of the case 444, 333. Now to find out what those are, right here we have number 4, and these bolts, at least from Suzuki, you can see it says 70B. They're the last 2 digits. That means it's a 70 millimeter bolt. Then you can measure these, and ideally you want to do this before you put the sealant on there. You have all this stuff prepared. But this is a 70 millimeter, so now where all the 4s are, that's where the 70 millimeter bolts go, and where the 3s go, they are 40B, so they're 40 millimeters. I have all those laid out right there. And you just look at the schematic, and it'll tell you exactly where they go. I'm putting a little bit of anti-seize on these as I go. Just dropping them in place first. I'm going to use the Milwaukee to run these in. I'm not tightening it down though. This is a great tool to have. It's an impact driver, so you don't want to tighten them with this. And it also has adjustment settings for how powerful the tightening torque is. If you're new with these impact guns, put it on setting 1. It goes to like 5 to 7 foot-pounds of torque. You don't really have to worry about stripping anything out. But I'm really just using this to run the bolts in place. It just saves a little bit of time. Not tightening them down just yet. Now I'm just going to snug these by hand, and I'm going to go in a crisscross pattern. We'll be torquing them next, but I want to get the bolts in on the other side first. All right, let's see if we can flip this over without getting sealant all over our hands. Okay, same thing on this side, putting anti-seize on our hardware. And again, just going to run these in place. And now I'm going to torque these down to 6 foot-pounds, again going in a crisscross pattern. Now we'll flip this again, get the other side. And then once I think I have them all, I'll just go around and make sure I didn't miss any. Now's a good time to check, make sure your crank spins nice and freely. Also your transmission, it looks like we're good to go. And we're going to clean up the gasket material that oozed out. The best way to do that is to wait for it to dry, like an hour or so. And then you come by and you just scratch it with your fingernail or like a credit card and it peels right off. If you wipe it now, it's going to smear and get all over the place. Trust me, I've learned. So it's a good time to take a lunch or dinner break. All right, it's been a couple hours and now you can come in here with the good old fingernail and just scrape away your gasket sealer. Easy as that. Or if you're really cool, you can come in with this plastic razor and that'll get the job done too. Save your fingernails. We're going to get started on the right half of the engine. This is the clutch side. We'll start with the primary drive gear, the cam chain tensioner gear, and the balancer gear. So we'll start by putting this little pin into our crank. It slides right in the back. That's going to be like a little keyway for our balancer gear. Now you want to make sure that this gear is going in correctly. You'll see there is a part number stamp on the front, and there is also a little punch mark right here. That's going to face outward, and the blank side is going to face inward. It also has a raised portion. So that will go like so, again with the print facing outward. Just get that to slide on over that little pin. Okay, there we go. Now we've got our cam chain gear. This is going to go with this little notch facing outward and the big flat portion going in first. So we're going to put this on here. We're going to line that notch up with the keyway on our shaft like so. It's going to go right up against the balancer gear. And then we've got a key, a square key, and you'll see one half is rounded, the other half is square. We're going to put the square end inward, and it's going to fit right in that little notch in our cam chain gear. And next is the primary drive gear. This, I believe, can go either way. I don't see any differences on either side. The manual does not dictate. I do see a mark here where you can see where the cam chain gear was resting previously. So I'm going to put it in the way that it came out from the factory. Just line it up with that key and slide it in place. And next we have a spring washer. So this is a concave spring, if you guys can see. And what we're going to do is we're going to put it, it says in the manual, with the cupped portion facing inward. So the more raised portion will be facing outward. So we'll slide that in place. And then we've got a reverse threaded nut. The manual says to lubricate these threads before you put the nut on. So I'm going to put a little bit of assembly lube on there. And remember, this is counterclockwise. Okay, we'll tighten that nut in a second. First, I want to put the balancer gear on. We've got another one of these little pins that'll go into the shaft up there. Then we've got the balancer gear itself. And you'll see there is a side that's got these little punch marks right here and right here. They're both lined up. This is what the other side looks like. It's going to go with these springs facing outward and those punch marks facing outward. We will just slide this in place. Make sure it lines up with that key. And before we go all the way in, mine kind of popped in place real easy. Let me pull that out a little bit. We want to line up those little punch marks, just like so. And that's how you know that you've got the counterbalancer and the crank timed correctly. If they're not timed correctly, they can smash into each other. Your engine's going to vibrate like crazy, and it just won't work. So you got to make sure those punch marks line up. Next, we have this real big washer, and then a nut. This one is regular threads. Now, there's a couple different ways to tighten down this nut. We're going to do the crankshaft method, which is basically where we hold the crank to tighten this down. You could use an impact driver if you really had to. I don't know that I recommend that technique. You can also use the penny method, or so I use like an aluminum nail, something that won't damage the gears. You basically jam the gears so that they won't turn. I also don't know that I'd recommend doing that either, because this goes to 103 foot-pounds. That's a lot of pressure, and I don't know if I'd want to, rely on jamming the gears. You could get the clutch basket in there and, try a number of other things. There's also, if you have the flywheel installed, you can go around the other side and hold the flywheel from the inside. There's actually a portion on there where I think a 27mm socket can hold the flywheel, and then you can tighten this side. So again, we're going to use the connecting rod method. I'll show you how to do that. We want to try our best here to avoid any damage. So we're going to pull out our oil jet, just to get that out of the way momentarily, and we are going to put a rag here to protect our cases. Then we're going to take, this is a heavy-duty 1/2-inch steel bar. That'll go in there, and the connecting rod can only go so far before it bottoms out against the cases, and that will allow us to tighten this nut. This is one of those jobs where it definitely helps to have a friend to either hold the engine or have the bottom end in the frame so that you don't have to worry about the engine moving around. So we're going to be tightening this to 103 foot-pounds. That's a lot of torque. I'm a pretty big guy, so I can usually get it done on the bench myself. Sometimes you do have to come up with some creative ways, though, when you don't have a buddy to lend you a hand. So we're going to utilize the bench in our favor here. We're going to bring this to the end here, and I've got a block of wood to keep the cases safe, and we're going to use one of these expanding clamps. You can get these anywhere. I think I got this one at Harbor Freight, and that's going to prevent our cases from rocking backwards. And again, we're going to 103 foot-pounds in reverse. This should enable me to hold the case from rolling, and you want to grab your torque wrench at the handle. If you grab anywhere else, it actually changes the torque value. Make sure everything is good. There we go. That worked nicely. All right, we can take off our clamp, move our board, take our rag out. You can see there is no damage at all. And we don't want to forget to put our oil jet back in place. That is now tight. We'll go ahead and tighten up our counterbalancer real quick. Now this only goes to 37 foot-pounds, so I'm comfortable using the soft nail technique or the penny technique. And we're going to be going clockwise. So we're going to jam the gear on the bottom side. And the whole idea of using the aluminum nail is because this aluminum nail will crush before destroying the gears. You want to protect the gears. If you use a steel nail, you run the risk of damaging something. We go to 37 foot-pounds. All right. And don't forget to remove your nail. I have forgotten to do that before, and you got to go back in the engine and take it out. And I've had one where it just got shredded in there, but you can see it actually deformed the nail a little bit. Now I'm going to put the cam chain and the rear slider in place. I'm going to do this now because if you put the clutch basket on, you actually won't be able to get the cam chain on behind this gear. So if you forget that, then you're going to have to take stuff apart. So we're going to go ahead and do it now. This is a brand new, genuine Suzuki cam chain. You don't want to go putting an old stretched out one on. This came right from Partzilla.com. Partzilla is my go-to spot for OEM parts. Going to fish this. I guess we can come through the top And this will fish through. And we'll put this behind the primary drive gear. Get it on the cam gear and just throw that over the front for now. Now we're going to put the cam chain slider in place. You want to inspect this. Make sure it's good and smooth. It's not like grooved out or anything. This one looks like it's in good shape. Of course, you want to replace it. If it's not, this will fit in like so. Sometimes you gotta, there we go, give it a little bit of pressure. I'm going to use just a little bit of low strength Loctite on this. We've got a washer that's going to go behind, so it can be a little tricky. You've got to hold that against the case and then put your bolt through and get it started. This gets torqued to 7 foot-pounds. And then in the front here is where the other cam chain slider will go. That doesn't go in place right now, but there is a retainer that goes there with a small flathead screw. You want to make sure that this screw is in good condition. If not, definitely replace it. And we're going to put a little bit of high strength thread lock on here. So if you're using a Permatex or something, I would go with just a dot of red. I'm going to use a JIS screwdriver threading this in. You want to use a JIS, that's Japanese Industrial Standard. You don't want to use a regular Phillips. They look just the same, but there's just a slight difference in them, and it will not strip out the head. So I'll definitely use the JIS, and I'm just going to go ahead and snug this down by hand. Next, we're going to install the oil pump. This is the oil pump assembly with the inner and outer rotor on the back. In the front, you will have a small clip that's holding on your idle gear. So we're going to go ahead and pull that off, and then there's a pin in here, and there's also a washer. Now both the OEM service manual and the Climber recommend not disassembling the oil pump. Apparently the internals are not replaceable, so you'd have to replace the entire unit if it was bad. But in the interest of seeing what it looks like inside to make sure if it's good or bad, we're going to take it apart. To do that, on the back, we have the inner and outer rotor. We're just going to pop these both off. We're going to inspect these, of course. What we're looking for, you see on the outside there's a little bit of wear, these little ingrained lines. I can barely feel them with my fingernail. They are okay. What we're looking for is the surfaces on the inside. If you've got a lot of scoring and wear in there, it may feel smooth when you're turning it, but that usually will indicate that this needs to be replaced. I've had bad oil pumps before that feel fine turning them by hand, but they don't pump enough oil. So you want to make sure that you inspect that. And then same thing with the internal rotor. You're going to look for scoring marks around the outside here. This one looks okay. The face looks okay too. There's like a little bit of wear, but again, that's going to be okay. Really, the face is where I'm looking for wear marks. So these two both look good. There's a small pin here. We're going to pull that out. Now, if you look on the back, there's a screw right here. And this is where in the service manual they tell you not to remove this. Apparently from the factory, it's got a pretty heavy Loctite on it. However, mine came out pretty easy. So we're going to go ahead and pull it apart. You want to make sure you're using a JIS screwdriver. That is Japanese Industrial Standard. So that if you do have Loctite on there, you'll have the best chance of not jimmying up that screw. So we'll pull that off. And then there's this gold plate, which we'll pull apart. And you'll see we have two rotors on the inside here. So as you're pulling this stuff apart, you want to make sure that you remember how it comes apart. Plate, you want to check that, feel for any scratching. You can see the rub marks, but I don't feel anything. So this plate is probably just fine. Here is our rotor. Looks like about the same condition as the external rotors. Looking on the inside here and also on the surface here, making sure we don't have real bad scoring or anything. I think we're okay. I'm feeling this with my fingernail because I do see a little bit of wear, but not enough that I'm concerned about. I think this is okay. And you'll notice there is a punch mark on this. So we'll set that down there. And then on our shaft, this will pull out. I'm just taking my time with all this stuff. And you'll see there's a pin And there's also a washer. Whoops. And then lastly, we have the internal rotor. Again, just looking over this, make sure it's in good condition. This one looks good, and you can see there's a pin mark right there as well. And then beyond that, there is a washer right there. You might not notice it. It usually sticks if there's residual oil in there, but you want to make sure when you're putting this back together that this washer is in place. So what we're going to do, oh, and also you want to make sure the housing isn't scored up. You'll get wear sometimes along the edges here where those rotors spin around, and on the face. And you can see there's always going to be some wear marks just from friction. Really the key is making sure they're not deep. So using your fingernail is a good method just to make sure they're not too bad. All right, let's get this thing back together. So we're going to take our housing. First thing we'll do is take that washer, fits right in the groove like so. Now we're going to take our shaft, and you'll see on one side there is a slot for our clip. That's going to face the outside of the oil pump, the face, where it says Mikuni, and we've got the part number. So we're going to make sure that that clip goes outward. So that'll go in like this. Clip on this side. And over here, we've got pin. Pin will go in our shaft, like so. Then we've got our small internal rotor. You want to take that little punch mark and make sure that you can see it. You don't want to face that down. You want to face it upward, and that'll slide over the shaft and then over that pin, like so. Next, we have this thin washer. Whoops. That's going to slide on like that. And then we've got our external rotor. Same thing, we want the punch mark visible, so that's going to be facing upward. We will pop this in place. So next, we have our backing plate, and you'll notice the backing plate has a sunken portion, and that is where this little washer fits in. So if you have the wrong washer there, it won't fit. Only that little thin one will fit in there. So we're just going to pop this in place. It'll fit over those little dowel pins, like so. And I'm going to put a little bit of low strength Loctite on the screw because it says in the manual that from the factory this does have Loctite on it. And we'll go ahead and thread this in. And I'm going to snug this down again using a JIS screwdriver. Just get that good and snug. And that shouldn't fall out now because you've got the pin in there. That is good to go. So then on the back side, we've got our internal rotor. Before you put this on, you'll notice again, there's a pin. And then on this side, you can see where the shaft pin goes. So this side, see you can't actually access that. So we'll come on here, put our pin in place, then take the gear, line it up with the shaft, and you can see it fits right over that, like so. Next, we've got our external rotor. That's going to pop in place like so. Now we're going to flip this around. You want to hold onto these with your fingers because otherwise they'll fall off. And we're going to go ahead and put our idle gear on. Now, depending what gear you have, you may have a shoulder on one half of the gear. If you have the shoulder faces downward. So in either case, you're going to have this washer. The washer goes in place. Then you have your pin. Pin slides through your shaft. Get it about in the middle. And now if you have the flat one, it doesn't matter which way it goes. You'll be fine. And again, if you have the one with the shoulder faces towards the oil pump. So for this one, I'm just popping it in place. That is assembled. And then we've got a clip that's going to go on there. They always recommend use a new clip. And you'll notice usually one side is sharp and the other side is rounded. They want you to put the rounded edge downward and the sharp side outward. So I'm going to put this here. Take my snap ring pliers. And you don't want to open this up super wide. You only want to open it up just enough to get it on. because these are spring clips, and you can stretch the spring out. So I'm just stretching that out, getting it on there, and you want to make sure it goes in the groove. So this one's not in the groove. I'm just going to push on the shaft until it pops in place. You hear it just popped in right there. And just double check it. You want to make sure that it's all the way in the groove, because if that thing pops off when your engine's going, you're going to be in trouble, man. So this oil pump is good to go. It's all assembled. Just keep your fingers on the back here, because these gears can pop, or these rotors can pop right off. All right, now before we put this in the case, we want to inspect the case as well. Make sure there's no scoring in here. That is where the large rotor spins around. So make sure that's good. And you also want to make sure that you have some lubrication on this thing. Now, you may notice my parts are glossy, and that's because I've got a thin layer of oil on most of my stuff. But if you do disassemble this like we just did, make sure that you've got a little bit of oil on those rotors before you assemble it. It's just a good practice, and it's not going to hurt anything. I'm just putting a little bit on our rotors as well. And now, like I was saying before, we're going to line up the two punch marks and the pin like that. And this should drop in place fairly easily. There's no gasket or anything that goes in here. There it goes, no problem. Now we've got 3 flathead screws. You want to either replace these with brand new or make sure they're in really good shape. If these get jimmied up and you can't get it out, you're going to be pissed off. So we're going to put a little bit of the 1342, the low strength Loctite. If you were using a commercial brand, I would just do probably the blue and just put a very small amount. This is the Suzuki brand that I'm using. Just pop those in there. Then I'm going to take a JIS screwdriver and work these in. Nice and even. Just driving them in by hand. And after we get all 3 of these in there, I'll snug them up. And again, I'm just going by hand with this. I don't torque these. You do want to make sure that they're good and snug though. Now we'll put the idle gear in place. When this goes in, you'll notice there's a shoulder on one end. That shoulder is going to face inward towards the shaft. This is the shaft that's going to go on. This is a removable shaft. If you watched the beginning of this video, it is inserted from the other side. So it's possible, if this is not here, that it is missing. So you want to make sure that's there. You'll notice on the inside, there is a clip on it. If that clip falls off, it can be pushed through. So you want to make sure that clip is on there and that it's seated well, and then you're good to go. In most cases, that's never removed, so you won't have to worry about it. So we're going to go ahead, put a little bit of assembly lube on here. Then we'll take our gear, again with the shoulder facing inward. We're going to slide this on, line it up with our oil pump gear, and that should line up and push in place. There we go. You want to make sure that this is pretty snug. It's going to have a little bit of play, but you want to make sure it doesn't have excessive play. If it does, you want to replace it. And then we've got a small clip that's going to go on top. The manual wants you to run these with the sharp edge facing outward. And when we put this on, we're only going to stretch this wide enough to get it over this shaft, like so. You want to make sure that's still got good tension on it and that it's clipped into the groove all the way. Otherwise, that can fall off, and then your oil pump gear can fall off as well. So typically you want to replace this with a brand new one. If I'm being honest, I have reused them before. You just want to make sure that they're not stretched out of proportion. Then you definitely want to replace it. All right, now we're going to put the external shift mechanism in. That goes in this area here. I'm going to do it in a little bit of a different method than the manual shows, because in putting this together, I discovered that getting the shift cam stopper in place and putting tension on the spring, getting it under this little stopper on the case, is pretty difficult. So I came up with a different way that's a little bit easier. There's a spring that's going to go on the one side. You'll see there's a notch right here, and that's where the leg with the little curl on it of your spring, it'll fit right in that notch like so, and it's going to stay on the back end like that. Then we've got a bolt with a shoulder that's going to pop through this side, and then on this other side we have a thin washer, very small, and that's going to go on this side. It'll slide inside the spring like that. And keep your finger on the back. You want to make sure, especially if you have your cases tilted upward, you don't want that washer to fall off, because if it goes in your case, you might have a little bit of trouble getting that out of there. So we're going to get this in this bottom hole here, and I'm just going to get it started. Okay, now before I go any further, I want to get the other end of this spring underneath the stopper on the case. This is what's really difficult if you have the shift cam in place beforehand. So this is why we're doing it in this order. I'm going to take the back of that spring and make sure it's underneath the portion of the case, that little stopper. So then we can run our bolt in place. And you want to make sure, remember this is a shoulder bolt, you want to make sure it goes in the space for the stopper arm. You want to make sure it's not caught up on the shoulder. You'll know because when you go in tight like this, it'll still move freely. So that's in place, we're good there. Now we'll put the shift cam in place. You want to inspect this for any wear. Make sure that all of your points and stuff are good. They're not rounded out or anything like that. You'll notice there is a little slot right here that's going to line up with this pin in the back of our shift drum. But now that we have our shift drum stopper in place already, we're going to have to roll this out of the way so that we can get it in place. So I'm going to take a flat blade screwdriver, and I'm trying to do this so that you guys can see. We're going to slide this down and put the flat blade screwdriver in here like this. Then we'll line up our pin and our shift drum, and you'll feel it pop into place. Okay, I think I'm good. And before you release the tension on that, we're going to put our shift pin in place. You want to inspect that this doesn't have any excessive wear or pitting or anything. And of course, inspect your threads also. This will go in with no Loctite. We'll thread this in place. And once you have that threaded all the way in, you can take the tension off of the shift cam stopper. That's good to go. Now we'll come in and tighten these. The shift cam bolt goes to 17.5 foot-pounds. It'll probably roll, and then it will stop itself. And then you'll be able to tighten it. Okay, right there. Okay, that's tight. And then I'm going to take the bolt for the shift cam stopper and take that to 6.5 foot-pounds. Then it's a good idea to come in and check for function. Just make sure that the shift cam rolls and that the shift cam stopper moves up and down nice and freely, and that you didn't pinch anything when you were tightening it up. This one looks like it's good to go. Next is going to be the shift selector. We're going to put this thing together. It can be a little intimidating, but it's really not that bad. So on this side, you'll notice we've got two little holes on either side. We're going to take these springs and drop them into the holes on both sides. Then we have these small pins. You'll notice there's a flat side and a side that is slightly rounded. You want to put the flat side facing inward toward the springs. We'll go like that. Next is going to be the shift pawls. You'll see there's a square end and a rounded edge. The rounded edge is going to go in where that rounded portion is. Square edge faces outward. You want to make sure that the square edge is good and square. If it's not square, you might have issues popping out of gear. So this one looks good. You'll also notice that this little cutout in the back is offset. You want to put the thicker portion facing towards the outside of the shift mechanism. It goes in like this. So rounded portion facing in, thicker portion like so. And you'll see it kind of lines everything up with the spring and the pin. If you have it the other way, it's not going to be lined up like that. Now we'll come around to the other side. My spring popped out. Put that back in place. Then we'll get the pin in, again with the flat side facing towards the spring. Try to be patient with this. The springs will be fighting you. You want to be really careful that you don't let them fly out, because if you lose them, you might have a bad day. Okay, so then we'll get the pawl in place. Okay, like that. And just check for function. It should work like so. I'll give you guys a view from up here. You You can see where those grooves are in the pawls. This is good. Now hold those shift pawls in place with your finger, and we're going to put them in the shift cam. So we'll slide this here. You can depress those. You don't have to worry about them falling out now. And you'll see as you turn it, it can clip into place. So we're going to depress them and go halfway into where it clips. So we've got it clips there. We're going to go halfway. And we're just going to pull it out about halfway. Don't go too far, because if those shift pawls pop out, you're going to be looking all over for them. Then we're going to take this plate. The plate has countersunk portions. That's for our mounting screws. You want to make sure they're facing outward. Ooh, and we're just going to come back here and fish it on like so. And now you can push this in. And we're in place. You can let it clip if you want to, or you can push it back to where it was. And all you have to do is put your mounting screws in. You want to make sure these screws are in excellent shape. If they're not, definitely replace them. And on the back side, we're going to use the Suzuki 1342. That is their low strength Loctite. Regular blue Loctite will work just fine. I'll thread this in with my JIS screwdriver. Just tightening this down by hand, making sure they're nice and snug. And then we've got a small top hat here. It's going to be placed right like so. Then we've got our shift shaft. This is a brand new one, right from partzilla.com. I'm going to put a little bit of assembly lube on here. And there is a seal on the opposite side of the engine. You want to make sure that you lubricate the inner lip of that seal. And if you haven't replaced it, I would definitely recommend putting a new seal in there, because that's the last place you want to be leaking oil. It's such a cheap and easy seal to fix. This is just pushing right in place. We're going to line up with this pin back here and the top hat right here. So we'll just push this in place. And remember, it is popping out the other side, so you might have to give it a little bit of pressure to get through your seal, especially if it's a new seal. Pop on there. Okay, and make sure that we're in place over here, that it went through the gap, and over here as well. All right, now I'm going to spin around this engine. And then on this side, we've got a washer that slides in place. And then there is a clip we're going to put on. This is another clip that I would recommend using a brand new one. And we're going to stretch it just far enough to get over the shaft. You don't want to overstretch these things, or they can fail. You need to have some tension left on them. Okay, and make sure that it's clipped all the way in the groove. This one looks good. Now's a good time to check the function of the transmission. So I've got the shifter attached to the other side of the shift shaft, and what we're going to do is just run through the gears. It can be kind of clunky doing this on the bench. The engine's moving around and stuff, and sometimes it'll seem like it doesn't want to go into gear. As long as you can get it into all of the gears, you should be just fine. If you are having trouble getting it into the gear, it's a good idea to spin your main shaft or your counter shaft, and that'll usually let it get into gear. So right now I've got it in neutral. There we go. We've got it in first, second, third. Oh, I don't think we got it. There we go. Fourth, and I think that's fifth. Oh, there it goes. Now it's in fifth. So you can see it can be a little bit clunky, but you just want to make sure that it goes into all of the gears before you go any further. If it doesn't go in, you want to go back in and just run through everything, make sure you did everything right. I'm kind of glad that this one was a little clunky so that you guys can see how it is sometimes. But, you know, I've done this plenty of times. There's a lot of times where they're just difficult to shift on the bench. But once you get the oils and the engine is running and everything, it should shift just fine. Again, you just want to make sure that it does go into all of the gears, and you can roll the transmission and it's not popping out of gear or anything like that, even on the bench. Now we'll do the clutch assembly. First thing we have is this sleeve. Going to put some lubricant on our main shaft. Slide this in place. I like to just spin it around. Make sure you get all that lubricant on there. Now put the clutch basket in place. Mine may look a little different than yours. I have an aftermarket billet basket on here. Regardless, it's going to go on the same way. You want to inspect the fingers of your clutch basket, whether it's aftermarket or not, and you will see little grooves in them. If the grooves are too deep, you want to replace the basket. That'll give your clutch a notchy feeling when you're pulling it in and out. and you don't want that, so definitely replace the basket. This basket will be linked in the description below. It's pretty inexpensive because this platform is shared with the KFX400 DVX400 and the DRZ400, which is the motorcycle version. It's very, very popular, and because of that, there's a lot of affordable aftermarket baskets for this platform. So put a little bit of lubricant on there, slide the basket in place. You'll probably have to rotate it to get it to line up with all of your gears. There we go, we're in place. Then next we've got this thick washer that goes in place like so. Next we'll put on the inner hub. You want to inspect the surface here where your clutch fiber goes. That can get chewed up really easy, and also on the inside, these fingers, they can get grooved up as well. So a pretty inexpensive part to replace. This is a new one actually for a KFX400. It's the same part for the LTZ or the DVX400. I went ahead and replaced mine because it was in bad shape. So we're going to line up the splines, and that drops in place like so. Then we've got a lock washer. This is going to go in place. Same thing, we'll just line it up with the splines. Drop that in place. Next we've got the clutch nut. We're going to put this on in a second. First I'm going to put a little bit of red Loctite on there. This is the Amazon brand. I really like this stuff. It's not quite as strong as like a Permatex or a name brand. It's a good in-between, but you don't want it to be super strong for this purpose. It's a little bit of an extra measure. It's not even in the service manual. And I'm just going to put it on the threads of our shaft. Then I'm going to go ahead and spin this on. You'll notice there is a flat side, a sharp edge, and a rounded edge. We're going to put the sharp edge facing inward. Spin this in place. Now we're going to lock this down to 52 foot-pounds. You can put your clutch pack in there and then hit it with an impact gun. That is one way to get it done if you don't have this tool. But I highly recommend getting this clutch holding tool. They're only like between $15 and $20. They have them on Rocky Mountain ATV, and it will be linked in the description below. It just does a great job of holding the inner hub. So we're going to get this with just a little bit of tension, and it clamps down like a vice grip. Doesn't need to have a lot of tension on there. We're holding it from spinning this way. It doesn't really need to be gripped down super tight. So then we'll put this up against the bench. The bench is going to be our friend. We're going to set our torque wrench to 52 foot-pounds. We're just going to come right on down. And that's all that it needs. Now with that red Loctite on there, I've never had one of these clutch nuts back off, so I usually don't fold over these locking tabs because they're such a pain in the ass to get back off. But since this is a tutorial, we'll go ahead and do it. A channel lock is a great tool for folding those over. We're just going to come in here and catch the edge of that washer, and then the tool will just squeeze and we can fold it up. It's just kind of a pain to get in here. There we go. Now we're going to build the clutch pack. There may be a couple differences with your clutch pack. The 03 and 04 clutch, I believe, is different than the 05 Plus, but they're still going to go together relatively the same. Some of the components might look a little different. I believe the tops of the springs look a little bit different. Just a couple things to note. Now we're also going to be doing what's called the full fiber mod. So this clutch plate here is the first one that will go in if you're not doing the full fiber mod. So I'm going to show you the difference. This is an aftermarket clutch, so you may have, here's an OEM plate. It may look slightly different, but regardless, the first plate that goes in is like a half plate. It's basically about 60% of the size of the full plate. You can see the full plate here is the one down below, and then this is the half plate. Now, if you do use the half plate, there's going to be a judder spring on the inside. I'll explain that as we go through it, but we are not going to be utilizing this half spring. Instead, I'm replacing it with an OEM full spring. So we will have all full springs in our clutch pack. I do recommend this mod. The reason for these half plates and the judder springs that go in between is for an extra soft and smooth clutch feel. But just like with a chain, you are only as strong as your weakest link. So this half plate usually gets burnt up first, and then your clutch is gone. So I just never run those things. We're going to run these. And then we've got our steels here. This is a brand new kit. We're going to go ahead and get it oiled up with whatever oil you choose to use. I'm going to be using AMSOIL synthetic. I use the 10 weight 50 dirt bike oil. It works really well. And we're just going to put a little bit here. Using a paper plate is a great method for saving the mess. So we'll just put that oil on there. There's also the controversial, leaving your clutch sit for 24 hours in a bag of oil. Then there's some people that run them dry. The way that I do it, I put the oil on as I'm installing it, and then the engine's not going to be run for 24 hours regardless. So it's going to be soaking in the oil when it's inside the engine. So we're just going to put it in the plate. Make sure that you get oil all over all of the fibers and on the steels as you're putting them into the clutch basket. All right, now over at our basket, I'm just taking a paper towel and I'm going to stuff it underneath here because usually as you're doing this, the oil is going to want to drip down. So I'm just going to try to keep it a little bit clean. If you're going to do the traditional way without the judder springs, the first spring in is the first fiber in is going to be the half one, and then there'll be two washers, big washers that go around and on the inside of this plate. One of them is flat and the other one has a concave. So we're not running that. We're gonna go ahead and just go straight for the fibers. Okay, so we're gonna go full fiber. And then steel, and you'll notice there is a sharp edge and a rounded edge. Some people like to put all sharp facing out. Some people do all rounded facing out. Other people mix them. I don't think it makes a difference. I'm gonna do it with the sharp edge facing out. We'll fit this in place. Another fiber. This is the OEM Suzuki one that is replacing the half. I just like to put it in the middle of the pack. And you'll notice there's little notches on the outside of these clutch fibers. I don't really think it matters how you put those in, but I like to stagger them. We're gonna go, the last one is right there. I'm just gonna go 1, 2. Steel, fiber, 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 1, 2. Steel, and this is the last fiber, 1, 2. Okay, now you can just take this paper plate, your gloves, and toss it out. No fuss, no muss. Now we're going to install the push rod. This goes in either way. I'm going to put some lubrication on here. It's going to slide right in like so. You might have to spin your actuation arm to get that to settle in like that. And then you can see the actuation arm will push that push rod in and out. And then on top of that goes the clutch pusher. It's going to go in like so. And then on top is going to be our pressure plate. Just like with the inner hub, you want to inspect this surface. And you've also got a bearing in here. You want to make sure that that bearing is nice and smooth. Otherwise, you do want to replace that. And we're going to put this on. You want to make sure that sits nice and flush up against your fibers. The clutch springs are going to go in next. There is the spring, then this cupped washer, and then your Allen head bolt. I'm going to put these in, and I'm using the impact only to run them in for purposes of speed, but you do not want to tighten it down with the impact driver. These things are pretty fragile. Okay, now we'll tighten these down to 6.5 foot-pounds. These do not need Loctite. We're getting ready to put the clutch cover on. Before we do that, there's a couple things we need to check. We have a seal that goes back here. I know a lot of people are not going to want to replace this, so at least check and make sure that it's in good condition. I've got a brand new one in there. There is a retainer right here with a Phillips head screw. So definitely check that out. It's very inexpensive to replace. Definitely recommend doing so. The other thing we need to do is put the oil check valve in. This is one of those pieces that probably no one will have removed. There is a rubber piece right here. You can see there's a cupped side and a flat side. Then we've got a spring and a ball. So first thing that goes in is the spring. It just drops in place like so. Then the ball goes in place. and then the rubber seal. I've already put a little bit of lubricant on here. I'm going to go ahead and put just a little bit more on. And this will go in with the cupped portion facing towards your ball. And that just pushes in place like so. Next we have the water pump assembly. I ordered this brand new right from Suzuki. It is sold as an assembly like this. You can order the bearings and seals separately, but it's actually more cost effective to replace the whole unit. It comes with the impeller, this aluminum housing, and everything. I got mine brand new from Partzilla.com. Definitely, like I said, there's no point in ordering the bearings and rebuilding it yourself when it's more cost effective to get the whole damn thing. So we've also got a seal that's going to go right here, an O-ring. I'm going to put a little bit of lubricant on that, and also around this O-ring right here. All of this stuff comes with the kit. The O-ring here does not, but this O-ring does come with the kit. And we're going to push this through. It'll just come through like so. I'm going to keep it upside down like this because you want to make sure that that O-ring stays in place. And I'm just going to ease this in place. Don't go crazy. You don't want to rip the O-ring as you're pushing this through. This can be pretty tight, but if you just wiggle it back and forth, it should get pretty much flush. That should be good. Now on the back side, we're going to get the impeller gear on. First we have a very thin washer. That's going to go in place first. Then we have a pin. Pin is going to go in place. And then the impeller gear, you can see, has a space for that pin. That part is going to face downward and line up with the pin. Like so. And then we have a clip. We're going to face it with the sharp side facing outward. And that will go right on the end. And just like with all of our clips, just want to make sure that it's seated in the groove. This one is good to go. Next we're going to put our dowel pins in place. I'm going to put a little bit of anti-seize on these. There are 2 of them, 1 on each side. Anti-seize helps so that if you have to tear this thing down again, it will come apart much easier. I've got 1 that goes down here, and I always recommend using new dowel pins. They're very, very cheap. They're like $2. Brand new OEM. And 1 goes back here. Then I'm going to roll the clutch assembly. You might have to pull your cam chain up. I'm just doing this because all of that oil is probably settled at the bottom from putting our new clutch pack in. So this way that'll bring it back up to the top. I'm going to try to avoid the drips here. And we'll remove our little oil catch. Now we're going to put the gasket in place. This is a brand new Suzuki OEM gasket. Really a pleasure to be working with OEM stuff on this build. And we've also got the OEM super grease. This is not in the manual, but I do like to grease my gaskets. It really helps if you made a mistake or something and you have to take the cover off, or even down the road when it comes time to change the clutch or something. Greasing the gaskets helps with a sealing effect. And it also keeps them in good condition so that when you pop the side cover off, usually the gasket will peel right off and it's not sticking to the aluminum, which is just a huge pain in the ass. So I'm just going to grease this up, and now I'll hang this on our dowel pins. Okay. And if you can't use the Suzuki gaskets, I always recommend using quality gaskets. Cheap Chinese gaskets, they're just not worth it. Most of the time they don't line up right. They leak or they rip. They're not good. Gaskets are a cheap thing, even to get the premium ones. So if I can recommend anything, it's that. So we're going to go ahead and put this clutch cover in place. You may have to spin the impeller to get your gear to line up. And it'll probably pop into place over top of the dowel pins and the oil seal. That went on pretty easy. Pretty much all the bolts that go around this perimeter are going to be this same size. I'm going to put anti-seize on all of these. Now there is one that is a little bit different than the other ones, and that's this one right here above where the oil filter goes. And for that one, there is a rubber washer that goes in place. You could probably get away with using like a copper or an aluminum washer, and the reason is this bolt hole goes through to the cylinder and oil could come through there. So it's just a sealing washer to make sure you don't get any oil leaks. So make sure you pay attention to that one. We'll go ahead and put that one in place now. I'm going to run all of these in with the impact, but I'm not going to use it to tighten it. And I'm going to go in a crisscross pattern. This just makes it quick to run them in. Now I'll put the water pump cover on. There is a gasket that goes on the back. I'm going to take a little bit of grease and put some grease on the gasket. And then there's a groove on the back. This will go in here. The grease is going to help this stay in place. There's a little dowel pin right here that we're going to line up with the hole in the back. Just like that. Then we've got 3 shorter bolts to go in place. And then one longer one goes in the top. And then the coolant drain bolt goes on, and there's a little aluminum washer that goes on here as well. That'll go in the bottom here. I'll run these in place. Now I'm going to torque down all of these cover bolts to 6.5 foot-pounds. And I'm going to go in a crisscross pattern. And when I'm done, I like to go around and just double check, make sure that I didn't miss any of these. Then up here we've got an oil check bolt. This gets one of those little rubber washers as well. You could probably use a copper washer or any kind of crush washer on there. I do have some anti-seize on the bolt. Just going to thread this in place, and I'm going to torque this down to 6.5 foot-pounds. Down here gets an oil level check bolt, and then there is an aluminum washer, crush washer that goes on there. Also have some anti-seize on this. This will also get torqued to 6.5 foot-pounds. Then there's an oil pressure check plug that goes right here, and I've got an aluminum crush washer going on the back. I did put some anti-seize on this as well. Pretty much all the bolts are getting anti-seize. I'm going to torque this to 11 foot-pounds. And then last but not least, the drain bolt for the oil filter. I've got the new drain bolt here, and I also have a brand new crush washer on there. Got some anti-seize as well. This will spin in place, and this will get torqued to 14.5 foot-pounds. We're almost done with the clutch side. We're going to put the oil filter in place. We've got a brand new O-ring here. This goes inside like so. Then we'll put our new oil filter in. We've got a brand new oil filter. Suzuki Genuine. Pretty awesome. Came from partzilla.com. Let's pop this bad boy open. And it's going to go in place with the opening facing inward. Like so. Then we're going to grease up a new O-ring for the oil filter cover. We'll put that in place on the back side. Then we've got a spring. It will pop into place and kind of lock and stay like that. Then we're going to spin this around, and you'll see there is a little arrow on one corner. That is going to face up, and we'll run our hardware into place. These will get tightened to 6.5 foot-pounds. And the clutch side is done. All right, let's turn this engine around and we'll do the stator side. Okay, so now we can slide the starter gear on. We want to make sure the crank is good and clean. I'm going to put a little bit of lube on the upper shaft where this gear is going to sit. we'll just slide this in place. I'm going to give it a roll, let that lubricant get in there. That should be good. Now we've got our shaft key, or woodruff key. It's like a little half moon. We're going to put that in with the curved portion down. And I'm going to spin this so you guys can see it. And I'm just going to drop that in like so. Make sure it's all the way in there. I'm going to give it a tap and just make sure that it's seated all the way in there. Now I'll put the flywheel in place. This is a good time to inspect it. Make sure you do. A lot of times you have like metal shavings and stuff that are stuck in here because these are magnetic. And I've also put a little bit of assembly lube on our starter clutch gear. So we're going to line up our little groove with our key. And we will just drop this in place. Okay. Looks good. Then I'm going to use the Amazon red thread locker. Regular red thread locker will work as well. If you are going to use regular though, like a Permatex or something, I wouldn't use quite as much because the Amazon brand is not as strong. I really like using this stuff. Sometimes it's not available. I'll have it linked below. It's just a lot of times it's, for whatever reason, it's sold out. So in the case that you can't get that, a regular red Loctite will work. I just wouldn't put quite as much. So we'll spin our nut in place. It's a regular thread. Now to tighten this down, the manual wants you to use an offset 27mm wrench, which will grip the inside of this flywheel. But who the hell has one of those laying around? I don't have one, and even if I did, I would still do the method that I'm going to show you now. I like to do different methods in these videos because I know that not everybody has access to the same tools. If you did want to hold this, you could use the crank method like we used on the other side and just spin it down to where it needs to go. Put your rag in there so that you don't damage anything up top, and then you could torque it down. But again, I like to do different methods in my videos, so we're just going to use the good old impact gun. I'm going to take our rag up here, just put it around the crank in case things get crazy, and I'm literally just going to hold this with my hand, and we're going to blast it on with the impact driver. The manual says 87 foot-pounds of torque. So if you're going to do this, you want to make sure you have a pretty strong impact driver. Otherwise, you might not get it on there tight enough. So we'll go ahead and give this a couple buzzes. You don't have to kill it, but you definitely, like again, you do want it to be nice and tight. So that is plenty tight, trust me, especially with an impact driver like this. So we are good to go. And again, if you do want to torque it, you can get that 27mm offset wrench. And let me bring you in here. You can see on the inside here, it looks like a nut. That's where that 27mm wrench would grip so that the assembly doesn't spin. But again, you can do that method, or you could do the crank method, which is my preferred method. I just like to, again, do different methods in these videos so that you guys can see how, there's more than one way to skin a cat. All right, now we've got our lower idle gear. It's going to go in place right here. This is the gear. It's like a little double gear, and I'll show you how the washers go on this. So we've got a shaft, and you can see on one side it's larger, the other side it's more narrow. There's a clip on here. You want to make sure that that's in place and it's not loose. Chances are nobody has ever removed that. Then we've got a thin washer, goes on this side, and another washer. It's the same exact size. That's going to go on this side. And then our gear, and this can go either way, will slide on like so. Now my motor is tilted back, so if I go and try to put this on, this washer is probably going to fall off. So we're going to take a little bit of grease and just kind of smear it on the edges here. And that is going to make it so that this washer will stick, even if we have it upside down. Because we don't want to lose that washer in there, especially now. It could go in the bottom end, and that'd be a freaking nightmare. So we'll go ahead and drop this in place, like so. And you should be able to spin this. You can see it turns the starter gear in the back. Now we'll set up the stator cover. So this is the back side of the stator cover. We're going to put our stator in place. This may not have been removed. A lot of people just take off the whole cover. They don't even move the stator. This is an aftermarket stator. The OEM one is a brown color. So just keep that in mind. Yours might be a little bit different than this. You want to orient this in here so that the wires are facing towards this little exit right here. That's where your grommet is going to go. So we'll put this in place and just line up our holes right about there. We've got 3 Allen head bolts. I'm going to put a little bit of the Suzuki low strength thread lock on here. A medium blue would be fine if you're using a different brand. just a little bit. Keep these, you don't want them vibrating loose. These don't have to be crazy tight. They're really small. I think these are M4s or M5s. They can strip out pretty easily. Now I'll put the pickup coil in place. You want to make sure that this is oriented correctly. You want to face it downward like this, because it can actually be mounted this way, and that's incorrect. So you want it downward, and you want to make sure that the little silver piece is facing towards the stator. And take note of your wire. You want to make sure that that is tucked away, because your flywheel is going to come in here and that moves. So you want to guard that wire against getting damaged by the flywheel. So just make sure that wire is tucked back there. Going to get the hardware in place, and I do have a small amount of medium strength Loctite on these, just a very small amount. These are small bolts. I'm not going to torque these. I'm just going to run them in by hand and just snug them down. And you don't have to worry about this being adjusted because it's not designed as an adjustable coil. Then we have this little wire guard that's going to go in place. That goes over here to protect the main wires coming from the stator, again, from the flywheel. Got another bolt right here. It's the same as these two, and it will also get just a little bit of medium Loctite. Make sure you're not pinching any wires as you're putting this in. Again, just snugging that by hand. Then if you've got an aftermarket stator like me, you may have this excess wire. So what I'm going to do is get the grommet pushed into the case where it goes, and we'll just gently pull the slack out of these wires. You don't want them in the case because, again, that flywheel is going to be in there spinning around, and you don't want them rubbing up against the flywheel. They will definitely get destroyed. So we'll just pull that out and then pull our wire sheath down like that, and that should be fine. If you have an OEM stator, you probably won't even have to worry about that. Almost ready to pop that cover in place. We've got 2 dowel pins, putting a little bit of anti-seize on these, and we've got one that goes up top here and another one that goes down here. Gonna grease up my OEM Suzuki gasket. Again, highly recommend using either OEM gaskets or a name brand. Brands like Vertex are good, Cometic is a very good brand, but you definitely do not want to use the Chinese knockoff brands. I'm telling you, you might be able to get away with them, but they're more of a headache than they're worth. You know, spoil yourself. Spend $20 on a gasket kit instead of 10. You know what I'm saying? So these OEM ones actually are a little bit more expensive than that, but well worth it in my opinion. So we're going to go ahead and hang the gasket on our dowel pins. Boom. And now we can put the cover in place. This may get sucked on. Oh, there it goes. The magnetism from the stator is going to pull it in. And just want to make sure up here, that is where that little idle gear shaft goes, is lined up. And the dowel pins, and just let this walk in nice and slow. Tapping it in place, getting it on those dowel pins. I think we are good to go. Now as far as hardware goes, we've got 4 longer bolts and 4 shorter bolts. To figure out where they go, I'm going to use the Partzilla website right here on the phone. If you go to your model, you can see I've got LTZ400. It's a 2003, and they have a diagram right on here. If you go to the crankcase cover, and you can see they're marked 17 and 18. 17 are the shorter bolts, 18 are the longer bolts, and we can match that up with our cover and find out exactly where they go. So we've got a longer bolt here, longer bolt down here, and then on this side we've got the reverse lockout plate, and 2 longer bolts go through this and then through the case. There's one up top and one down the bottom, and then the remainder are all shorter bolts. And you want to make sure that you don't forget there's a bolt that goes inside here. You have to tighten that down now. I'm going to run these in place with the impact. I'm not going to tighten them down with this. This is just makes it really quick getting them in place. And then I'm going to tighten these down to 6.5 foot-pounds, and we'll go in a crisscross pattern as we're doing it. Then we have our timing plugs. There's a large one here. You want to make sure you put a new O-ring on here, and you do want to lubricate that with either a little bit of grease or put a little bit of oil on it. And then there's another plug right here. This one does have a crush washer. If you don't have the crush washer from Suzuki, you can put either an aluminum washer on there or a brass washer, and you should be okay. The little one is going to go up here, and then the big one goes in the center here. Now, I'm not going to tighten these down because we will be removing them when we do the top end, but if you are going to tighten them up, I would just snug these down. They don't need to be super tight. And I'd also recommend putting a little bit of anti-seize on them because they do have a tendency to get stuck. Now we'll put our starter clutch gear, and it goes right in here. Here is the gear. It's pretty complex looking, and there are a couple sleeves that go on here and washers. So on the front side, you've got this washer, and then this little sleeve goes over top, and then on the back, it's the same thing. We've got one little sleeve, and there's a washer. So both washers are the same on both sides, and the sleeves are the same on both sides. So you can't mix them up. You put those in place like so. I'm going to put a little bit of grease on mine because I have my engine tilted for the video, and this will fall off if we go to put this on. So that grease should hold it in place. And we will just go ahead and slide this in. You may have to spin it and line it up with your gear. Oh, gotta be careful there. Okay, there we go. My little sleeve popped off. Slide that on there. Then we have a cover that goes in place. This can go in any orientation. It doesn't matter. There is an O-ring that goes on the back. You definitely want to replace that and put some grease on it. And it will pop right in place. And we've got 3 bolts. We'll put a little bit of anti-seize on all of these. I'll tighten these to 6.5 foot-pounds. Now I'll put the starter in place. That's going to go right in the back of our cover. Believe it or not, this is the original starter from this 2003 Z400. Disassembled this, had the ends vapor blasted, and then the center is zinc coated by Moto Blast. Rebuilt it, got brand new brushes in there, right from Partzilla.com, all OEM stuff. Looks phenomenal. And we've also got a brand new OEM O-ring on here. You want to make sure you've got a brand new O-ring. We're going to put a little bit of grease on there, and I'm also going to take some grease and put it on the starter gear. And this will just slide right in the back. You just got to mesh it up with your gears, and we'll push in that O-ring, pops in place. Line up our bolt holes back here. We've got 2 M6s that go back here. Got a little bit of anti-seize on them. And these will go to 6.5 foot-pounds. Now down here by our shift shaft, we've got our gear indicator switch. This is going to go right there. On the back side, you can see where the contacts are. We're going to go ahead and put a new O-ring in. I'm going to grease this up, and it'll sit right in there. And then we've got 2 contactors and 2 springs. You got to be careful because these can come off. So make sure you don't lose these things. They're going to go right in here. This is the back side of the shift drum. So I'm going to try to do this so you guys can see. I'm going to take the springs, drop that in place, drop the second. Oh shit, really got to be careful you don't lose these things. Put the second spring in there, and then the contactors, one in the middle and one up top like that. All right, now I'm going to tuck my wire behind our plate here, and we'll put the switch in place. Make sure you got the O-ring on there. It'll go like so. We've got 2 small Allen heads that go in place, and then these only go to 4.7 foot-pounds, so I'm just going to snug them by hand. Now we're going to put our sprocket on. Got a brand new one right here. Got the Suzuki genuine parts. Pretty awesome. Came right from Partzilla.com. Pop this bad boy open. And you can see it has right on there, it's marked outside. So if that isn't clear, that faces the outside. I'm going to take a little bit of anti-seize and put it on our shaft. We will slide this in place. Man, that's nice. Then we've got the locking plate. There's a rounded edge and a sharp edge. I'm going to put it with the rounded edge facing outward. We'll slide that on the splines and then spin to line up our 2 mounting holes. And then our mounting hardware are these little shoulder bolts. And we're going to use the Suzuki 1303. This is their high strength. So a red Loctite would work for this. You don't want your sprocket bolts falling off. That is for sure. We're going to tighten these down to 7 foot-pounds. As long as you're in gear, the sprocket shouldn't spin. All right. And then next we have our chain guard and chain cover. Now I highly recommend running a DRW case saver if you have the option. I'm doing more of an OEM build here, so I am going to run the stock stuff, but these are notorious for breaking and causing case damage. The DRW ones are about 50 bucks and they're way more protective than the stock one. I also typically wouldn't put this on until the engine is in the frame, but just to show how this goes, we'll put it together. Then of course we've got the actual guard itself goes in the back, and it'll go like that. Now there's also going to be a wire stay that's going to go on this top bolt right here. I'm not putting that on right now because it's just going to be in the way. But if you do run, oh damn it. But if you do want to run that, that's just something to take into consideration. We'll move our wires out of the way, get this lined up with our bolt holes. And this is the original cover from 2003. I sanded and painted it, found a paint that matches it pretty nicely. Tighten this down to 6.5 foot-pounds, and we are almost done with the bottom end. In the front here, we've got this little oil plug. It's an Allen head, and you do want to put a new crush washer on the back. And sometimes when you're threading these in, they'll want to go off to the side. So I kind of like to guide it with my finger. You don't have to use one of these OEM Suzuki style either. If you have a copper washer or an aluminum crush washer, that should work just fine also. So we're going to go ahead and just throw this in. I also did put a little bit of anti-seize on it, just so that this thing doesn't get stuck in here. And then I'll torque it to 12.5 foot-pounds. And of course underneath we've got our drain bolt. We've got a brand new crush washer on there, and I do put anti-seize on these. Thread this in place. And this will get torqued to 15 foot-pounds. All right, our bottom end is complete. Now we're going to move into the top end. First thing we need to do is inspect our cylinder. This is an OEM cylinder. This came off of this engine, and you can see it's got fresh Nicosil coating on the inside. So you don't always have to replate your cylinder or get a fresh one, but you do want to inspect it and make sure that you have good cross hatching in here, and that it doesn't have any flaking Nicosil. Nicosil is the coating on the inside here, and this cylinder is a prime example. There was actually little parts that were chipping away. So it was kind of difficult to see, but when you take a close look, there can be damage. If you do need to send these out and get them replated, you can go to Millennium Technologies. That's where I had this one done. They'll replate the cylinder, clean it up. It'll come back looking like brand spanking new. This cylinder is literally 20 years old, if you can believe that. So this one is in good shape. If you're gonna go the replacing route, there's plenty of aftermarket options for the Z400. But if you do have the money, going OEM is typically the best route. No matter what you do, chances are you're gonna be using a brand new piston. I definitely recommend using a new piston if you've got your engine torn down. There's just no point in not putting a new piston in unless it was like a fresh engine that you had to tear down, maybe you forgot something inside. All right, so we're going to do the piston rings here. You've got oil rings, an oil expander, and the 2 main rings. These are the rings that we're most concerned with. We want to check the ring end gap. The ring end gap is the gap at the end of the ring, and we want to check it compressed. So we're going to put it in the cylinder, and then we'll check to see what the gap is at the end there. We'll do one at a time, and we're going to face these upward. It doesn't really matter for checking ring end gap, but it's just a good rule of thumb to put them in the correct way. And you'll see these ones are literally listed. It says top. Now this is a Nomura piston. It's an aftermarket. If you have an OEM, it may be different. If you have a Wiseco, it may be different. But typically, it is going to be indicated with some sort of marking, and the marking usually goes upward. The other thing you can notice, the top ring on the Z400, if you've noticed, there's a little bit of a ridge, and the ridge faces upward. So if for some reason there's no marking on your piston ring, face the ridge upwards. So we're going to take our cylinder, and we'll just compress our ring in like so. Now you can see that ring isn't sitting quite even in there. To even that out, we're going to take the piston and just come in from the bottom and push on up, and the ring will be nice and flush now. Now, typical rule of thumb for your ring end gap is going to be 0.04 of an inch per inch of diameter of your bore. So for this one, our bore diameter is about 3.5 inches. So for the first 3 inches, that would be 12 thousandths of an inch, the 3 times 4. And then for that extra ½ inch, that'll be another 2 thousandths. So we'd be at 14 thousandths of an inch, just by the general rule of thumb. Now, you do want to check your service manual if you have one, or if you got an aftermarket piston. They'll usually have some literature with it. So right here, we've got our ring end gap specifications. And you can see the standard is from, it looks like 0.08 millimeters to 0.2 millimeters, and they also have the inches under here, 3 thousandths to 8 thousandths, and the limit is 0.5 millimeters or 2/100ths of an inch, 20 thousandths. So what we're basically doing, we want to make sure that we don't exceed this limit, and hopefully, you know, we're pretty close to the 3 to 8 thousandths. So the gap that we're measuring is that tiny little gap right there. The tool we're going to use is a feeler gauge, very inexpensive. I will have this linked in the description below, but you can usually pick these up at your local auto stores, stuff like that. So we're going to pop this open. I usually go for the ones that have both the metric and imperial right there. So you've got all the different sizes on there. This is the largest one on here, and it's the service limit. You can see it's the 0.02 millimeter, or 0.5 millimeters, or 20 thousandths of an inch. So we're going to start with that, and this should not fit in there, and it does not, so that's good. And now we'll go to the minimum, which this gauge doesn't even go that low, so we'll just go to the smallest one, which is 5 thousandths. The 5 thousandths does fit in there, so we are in spec. And if we want to go in and check what size it is, I actually already cheated and went ahead, so we don't have to run through this. Ours is 13 thousandths of an inch, which is right by that estimate of 14 thousandths. It just barely fits in there, and when you bring it up and down, there's just a small amount of drag. That's perfect. So this ring is good. Now I'm going to put the second ring in and check it. These numeric kits are really clear. You can see it literally says second right on there, and it tells you it's the top. But again, basic rule of thumb, the side with the print typically goes up, and there's no ridge on the second ring for this Z400. Same thing, I'm going to put the ring in here, and I will get that nice and flush with the piston. And this one is actually a little bit tighter at 11 thousandths of an inch, but it is still within spec, so that is good to go. Both of our rings are good. And then we've got our oil rings and oil expander. The expander is wavy like this. These do not have specifications in the manual, so I'm just going to put them in here and make sure that the ring ends don't butt up against each other. Typically, these are never a problem. You can see there's a tiny little gap there, so these should be good to go. Now, if your ring end gap is too small, you either want to replace the ring or take a small file, and you can just gently file the gap in between the ring. Take off just a little bit at a time and keep rechecking until you're in spec. You don't want to put a ring in that has too tight of a tolerance, because what happens is these ring ends come together as the engine gets hot and they expand, and if there's not enough gap, they'll expand so much that they actually butt up against each other. They'll force into the cylinder wall, and it'll cause cylinder damage. If the ring gap is too large, I also recommend replacing the ring. However, if you do run a ring that has a gap too large, it will not cause any damage to the engine. You're just gonna get a little bit of blow-by and probably lose a little bit of performance, but I would definitely replace that. Now we're gonna put the piston rings on our piston. You'll notice on the side, we've got these 3 grooves. We've got the one at the bottom with the 3 holes. That's for our oil rings and oil expander. And you've got the groove at the top for our top ring, and the second ring is for the second ring. Pretty self-explanatory. We're going to start with the oil expander. That is the wavy ring. And something you want to take note of, you see these ends? You want to make sure that they butt together like this. Some oil rings, they can fold, they can overlap like that. Now this one is pretty obvious. I don't even think it would fit like that. But sometimes that can happen and you don't even notice. So just be conscious that when you put this on, that these butt up against each other. It can be run up like this or down like this. It doesn't matter. We're going to go ahead and just slide this over. And I'm going to try to stay conscious of where the ring end gaps go. The oil expander opening goes... Where did the opening even go? It goes towards the back of the piston. So you can see how I have it right there. Again, you can see that they're butt up against each other and not overlapping. And the top of the piston, there's usually a dot or an arrow, and it even says exhaust side. That'll indicate the front of the piston. So that gap for the oil expander goes right in the back. Now we've got our oil rings. These are both the same, and there's no indication of top or bottom. They can go in either direction. The bottom oil ring goes with a gap right about here. So I'm going to pop this in place. This goes underneath the oil expander, and I'm just going to take my time here and try not to stretch the ring too much. You don't want to damage it. Okay, that one is in place. Then we'll take the second oil ring. We're going to do the same thing, and the second oil ring goes with the gap over on this side, the top one. Same thing, just gently slide it over. Then we're going to put the second ring in place. Again, they're typically indicated with writing on the top. These Nomura ones, it literally says top, and it says the second ring. So we're going to put this in place. These ones are a little bit tighter, so just take your time here. The top ring, or second ring, goes in this orientation. The gap is right here. We'll just fit it into the slot and walk it in place. Okay. And last but not least is the top ring. You can see it says first, which would also be the top ring, and top. Again, if you don't have any markings, there's a small ridge on the edge of the upper lip of this ring. So the edge faces upward, and the top ring is going to go with the gap all the way in the back of the piston. Okay, piston is ringed up. Now we're going to put one of our piston clips in place. For the Z400, doing the right side, if you have the piston like this, arrow facing forward, the right side is going to make your life a little bit easier. These can be kind of cumbersome to get in place. You want to get the opening towards the bottom or towards the top. It has to do with centrifugal force. Believe it or not, with enough RPMs, these things can actually squeeze. Ooh, almost flick that away. These things can squeeze down and fall out. Super, super rare, and it's really only in like super high performance stuff. But just as a general rule of thumb, you want it up or down. So these can be kind of cumbersome to get in place. Usually you can sort of squeeze the first one in like this and then spin it into place. It's also a good idea to wear eye protection when you do this because you don't want to get these stuck in your eye. So that pushed in, not too bad. And then once you have it like that, you can take a flathead and just drag it into place gently. You're doing your best not to have this thing fling away. Okay, it popped in place. I'm going to make sure it's completely seated in that groove. Now we'll put our piston in place over top of our rod. Get our piston pin started. Line up the holes and just push your piston pin through. Okay. And of course you want to make sure that the indicator for the front of the piston is facing forward. Usually, no matter what brand piston you have, there's either going to be an arrow or a dot, or you can even see this side is marked EX. That's for the exhaust side. You know, the exhaust comes out of the front of the engine, so make sure the piston is in the correct orientation. Now getting this second clip in can be a little bit more of a pain in the ass because things are just a little bit tighter. And you want to stuff your crank, because if that piston clip falls in, it's just not going to be a good day, basically. That's what I'm trying to say. I try to walk this in with my fingers. Eye protection is definitely a good idea. And you're kind of on your own with these things. Just try to get it in there without having it fly away on you. Flathead screwdriver can come in handy. And usually, if you just kind of walk in the edges, you can get it to clip in place. Okay, I think we're in. Of course, double check. Make sure we're completely seated, and this one looks good. You can take our rag out of here. Now we're going to move into the cylinder. We've got two dowel pins. I'm going to put a little bit of anti-seize on both of these, and they're both going to go on the side opposite the cam chain. 1 and 2. You want to make sure your oil jet is in place back here. This literally just pulls out like this, and you do want to replace that O-ring if you haven't already, or at least put some lubricant on there if you're not going to replace it. But I do recommend replacing it. That just pops right there in place. And we're going to put our base gasket on. This is a brand new Suzuki OEM. Now this gets oriented like this. There's an extra hole right here that faces forward. We're going to go on dry with this one. Just fish it around our piston, pull our cam chain through, and we'll fit over top of our dowels, and there's 2 studs in the back. There we go. Now I got a little bit of my AMS oil in here. Whatever engine oil you're going to use, put it in a little cup or something. And I'm going to coat the inner walls of our cylinder. You want to make sure you get it all over all of the surfaces in there. We're also going to put a thin layer on the outside of our piston. And this is a good time to double check the orientation of your piston ring end gaps. Just make sure that everything is where it needs to be. Now I'm going to take my piston rings and squeeze them with my fingers. This can be a little cumbersome. We'll have our cylinder oriented in the correct way. We have the cam chain slider in the back that's going to slide through on the one side of the cylinder. And just take your time, slide the rings in place. They will go in. Sometimes it can be a little frustrating. Don't force it. And especially with the oil rings, you want to make sure that they are in the piston grooves and not hanging out, because those are really fragile. Alright, I've got my rings in the cylinder. I'm going to take my cam chain and fish it through the cylinder. This can be a little cumbersome. If you have like a hook or something on the other side, that can really help out from the cam chain falling through. But usually you can just hold it with your hand. And I'm just going to gently slide the piston into our cylinder. You want to watch these studs, make sure you're lining up with your cylinder. And then we'll get it over those cylinder dowels, and boom, we're in place. And then these 2 studs right here, we're going to be putting nuts on top of there, but we're not going to do those right now. We're going to come back to that. Now we've got a cam chain slider that's going to pop in place here. You don't want to forget putting this in place. Inspect it, make sure it's not grooved out or anything like that. And you'll see there's like a notch in the top here, and that top notch is going to pop in place here. So we'll lift our cam chain, just give it a couple tugs, make sure it's lined up on the cam chain gear, pull it to the side, and this will slip right in place. It goes right into a groove, and you can see it pops in place like so. Got 2 more dowel pins, putting some anti-seize on them. These get placed diagonally, one right there, and another one goes right there. I've got a fresh OEM head gasket. This is going to go in place dry. We're going to put this on in the correct orientation. You can line it up with the cases. You can't, it's kind of tough to put these on incorrectly. We'll fish our cam chain through and our cam chain slider, and then just put this over our cylinder dowels. Now we'll put the cylinder head in place. We are not going to do the valves in this video. If you have to service your valves, change out the seats, the springs, or anything like that, I recommend sending your head out for service. I had mine done by Power Sports Nation. They will completely service the valves, make sure everything is good to go, and this is how it comes back. See, it's got this thick rubber, I guess condom you would call it, on the bottom to make sure that it stays nice and safe during delivery. And you can see the head is perfectly surfaced. Man, that looks awesome. Got brand new valves in there. They can do the whole 9, whether your head needs to be repaired or if it needs to be replaced, they'll let you know that too. But they will bring it back to you in great condition. This is the original head from 2003. The only thing I did replace was the studs. I did do that on my own, but this is how it comes back from Power Sports Nation. So we'll go ahead and drop this in place. We're going to want to monitor your cam chain as you're putting this on. There's a bolt that's going to go in the front of your cylinder head. You want to get this on hand because it will hold the cam chain from falling in place. You'll see as we do it, this is the bolt here. It goes into the front of the cylinder, and there is a rubber gasket that goes in the back. Definitely make sure this is in good condition. If not, replace it. You can see there's a little ridge that goes around it. That faces upward. The part with some metal showing faces downward. So we're just going to have this on hand, ready to go. And we'll take our cylinder, run our cam chain through, and come up and around our slider, get that in place, line up with our cylinder dowels, and we can tap that in place in a second. We're going to take that bolt that I showed you and run it in here. This is just going to prevent the cam chain from falling into the engine. Now I can take a mallet and just gently tap around the cylinder, get it seated on our dowels. That looks good. Now we're going to drop our head bolts in place. There are 1, 2, 3, 4. These are the bolts right here. We've also got washers that are going to go on top. The washers are going to go, there's a sharp edge and a rounded face. The rounded face is going to go upward like this. Before we put these in, we're going to put a little bit of our engine oil on the threads and up around the washer. Taking a little bit of our engine oil, put it up here around the washer, and again down here on the threads. And I'll be doing this with all of our head bolts. Now I'm first going to run these in with the impact gun on a low setting. And now we'll actually tighten it with the torque wrench. We're going to do 2 passes. The first pass we're going to do 18 foot-pounds, and the second pass is 34 foot-pounds. So we'll go to 18 foot-pounds, and when we tighten these down, we're going to go in a cross pattern. So we're going to go over here, over here, over here, over here. It doesn't have to be exact. You just want to go in a cross pattern, and I'm going to use the swing arm bolt method, since if the engine was in the frame or you have a buddy to hold it, that'll work too. We're just going to take an extension and put it through where the swing arm bolt goes. That's going to help so that we can keep the engine from rotating as we tighten this down. So we're going to 18 foot-pounds. Okay, come across to the other side. Good. Up here. All right. Over here. Last one. Good. Let me just double check this one up front. Okay, we're at 18. Now we're going to jump to 34. You want to make sure as you're doing this, you're holding your torque wrench at the handle. If you hold anywhere else, that can actually change the torque value. Good. All right, head's installed. Now we can put these little cylinder nuts down here. Put a little bit of anti-seize on these. And then there are 2 bolts that go up here. Put an anti-seize on these as well. We're going to go to 7 foot-pounds with these. These ones go to 7 foot-pounds as well. I'm just going to snug them down by hand. They don't need to be crazy tight. That should be good. And this side bolt goes to 10 foot-pounds. In the back here, there's a little plug. This gets one of those little rubber washers. You could probably use a copper washer or an aluminum crush washer. Got some anti-seize on there. Thread that in place. And this will go to 6.5 foot-pounds. Okay. And while we're back here, we're going to put a brand new boot in place. This is a brand new OEM right from Suzuki. You can see there is a locator right here. That's going to line up with this little tab on the bottom. Before I pop this in place, I'm just going to put a little bit of grease on the inner lip. We'll just line up that locator, and this should pop right in place. And then on this side, I can snug down our inner clamp using a JIS screwdriver. Just needs to be snugged down. You don't have to go crazy with these. Then in the front here is where the thermostat goes. We've got a brand new one right here from Partzilla. We'll pop this bad boy open, and it'll go in place just like so. It fits a certain way. You can't go this way. There's two little slots. It kind of fits like this. I'm going to grease up the seal on the outside before we lock this in place. All right, I'll drop this in here. And then our duct goes in place on top. There's no gasket. The thermostat acts as a gasket. We'll put 2 bolts in here. I've got a little bit of anti-seize on them. And these will go to 6.5 pounds. We're going to move into installing the cams. Before we do that, we need to get the engine to top dead center. So we're going to take our timing windows out. We'll just unscrew these real quick. Now we can get a 17mm in here and we can turn the engine over. Now before we start turning the engine over, you want to grab your timing chain and get the slack out of it. Give it a couple tugs and get it on the timing gear. And you're going to want to hold tension on this as you're turning the engine over. If you don't do that, the timing chain can bind up. All right, now I'm going to turn the engine over, going counterclockwise, and we're going to look for a hash mark and a T. Oh, it's right there. So you can see the hash mark and the T, and you want to line that up with the little arrow right there indicated on the case. You want to line it up with the hash mark, not the T. I'll give you guys another look at this. That is your arrow, and you want to get it right in line with that hash mark. Now we're at top dead center. I'm going to spin the engine around, and as you're putting the cams in, you want to be mindful that the engine doesn't rotate. You want to keep it at top dead center. If you're not sure, just go back and check your hash mark, make sure it's still lined up. Now we're going to move into putting the cams in. Before we do that, we're going to try to get into the right ballpark for our shims. I know a lot of people get really scared when they talk about shimming valves. It can seem really confusing, but it's actually very simple to do. Shims are these little things right here. It's like a little spacer, and basically it's going to create the correct spacing for your valves. So a lot of times, you know, you're working with an engine that it either didn't run before you even had it, or it was a basket case, and you might have no idea where to start with the shims. So I'm going to show you how I get in the correct ballpark, because I have no idea with this engine. This engine was non-running, and I don't even think I was turning it over when before I pulled it apart. So we're going to start from square one. I'm going to try to make this as understandable as possible. Here are the shims. There will be a number imprinted on them. I don't know if you guys will be able to see. These ones are kind of faint, but this one says 312 on it. You can see it on there, and that is the size of the shim. So I'm just going to put these in place in the top of our valves, and then put our shim buckets on top of that. You can see I've already got lube in our cam journals and on top of the shim buckets. You want to try to keep everything lubed here. Now we're going to put the cam on top of that. This is the intake cam. There's 2 ways of telling. One, there is no auto decompression. If you look at the exhaust valve, this big thing right here, that's the auto decompression. So the intake side does not have that. It also says IN on it. So it's pretty obvious. We're going to put it with the lobes facing outward, and you want to check these too. Make sure there's no scoring or anything where they ride in the journals or on the cam lobes. Just want to make sure that's in good shape. And so we'll put this right here in the groove. We're going to put shims in the exhaust side as well. Might as well do both of them. There's shim buckets. And here's the exhaust cam. You can see this one says EX. Really hard to confuse these things. And we'll put the lobes to the outside. Lay that in place like so. Now to get an accurate reading, you want the cam to be rolled in the correct position. You see there's these numbers on the sides of the gear. It says 3, 2, and then over here it says 1. The intake side, you want the 2 to be about level with your cylinder head surface. And then on the exhaust side, you want the number 1 to be about level with the gasket surface. They don't have to be absolutely perfect, but you want to keep an eye on that. and make sure that the cams are in the right position when you're checking here. Now where we're going to measure is underneath the cam and on top of our shim bucket. This is where we need to get our feeler gauge into to see if we've got the right side or the right size. So I can already tell we're tight right here on this side. We can't fit in here. And over here, oh, well, this one's actually tight too. So we're tight on both of these. What we need to do is put a smaller shim in here, which will open up the gap between the cam and the shim bucket. Now, of course, when we have the cam covers on here, there's going to be more pressure on the camshaft. So again, this is just to get us in the right ballpark. If you push down with your hand and measure, you're going to be able to get pretty close. I'm going to use a magnet to get these shim buckets off. And just remember where these go. Now both of these shims are too big because we have zero clearance on either side. So I'm going to go ahead with a much smaller shim over here to get a starting point. We need to have a gap that we can measure, and then once we have that gap, we can see what the clearance is, do a little math, and we can figure out the shim that we need. Sounds confusing, but it's really not that bad. We're going to do it together, and hopefully you'll see how it's done. We're going to drop to a 200 or a 2 millimeter. This is a very thin shim, and this way we should have some clearance with our shims, and we'll be able to get a measurement off of it. Put our shim buckets on, drop our cam in place, and line it up where it needs to go. I put a little bit of pressure on the cam with my hand, and now you see we've got clearance, so we can get an accurate idea of what we need to do. Feels like they're both about 12 thousandths of an inch. Now we're going to do some basic math to figure this out. Just try to stick with me. We're going to do our intake side. The specification is 0.1 millimeters to 0.2 millimeters. So we're going to try to get right in between at 0.15 millimeters, but anywhere between those two numbers and we'll be good to go. Now currently the shim that we have in place is 2 millimeters and our gap is a little too large at 0.305 millimeters. So what we need to do to make this gap smaller is we need to make the shim larger. So the difference between the 0.15 and we'll just say the 0.30 is another 0.15. So we have to increase this shim by 0.15 millimeters. If we add 0.15 millimeters, that takes us to 2.15 millimeters. So this shim of 2.15 millimeters should bring us into spec. Okay, so let's try it out. We're going to pull the cam off, take our shim buckets off, take our 2 millimeter shims out. Come on, you bastard. Sometimes these freaking things don't want to come out. There we go. We're going to put the 2.15 in. Put our buckets back in place. Drop the cam in. Line it up, put a little bit of pressure on here, and we should be right around 155. This is 152. And I can feel a very small amount of drag. So I think we're good to go. I'm just going to see where these actually max out, just to make sure that we're within spec. Yeah, see, this won't even go in. So we're good to go. Now you're really supposed to take those specs once these are clamped down, but doing it this way gets you in the ballpark, and most of the time it's good to go, so that you don't have to keep taking the cam caps on and off and putting the bolts in and out to check every time. This way we're going to be pretty close. So I'm going to go do the same thing on the exhaust side on my own, and then we'll continue on with the assembly. To save you the headache of ordering shims individually and waiting for them to come in the mail, I highly recommend one of these shim kits. These will run you between 50 and 100 bucks, but they're going to have all the shims that you need, and in the grand scheme of things, it's going to be cheaper in the long run because going to the dealership to have your shims adjusted is typically going to be about 100 bucks anyways. Plus, then you can do all your buddies' bikes. Now that we have a good starting point with our shims, we're going to go ahead and do the full install of the cams. So we've got our shims and shim buckets all in place. You want to take a little bit of assembly lube, make sure that the top of the shim buckets and on where the cams sit, and these we want all the journals and everything with some assembly lube on them. I've already gone ahead and lubed mine. The first one we're going to put in place is the exhaust cam. So this is the exhaust cam here. There's two ways to identify it. One, you've got the decompression system right here, and we can inspect that, make sure it works. It will open and close. It should spring close on its own. Check it for function. The other way you can tell is pretty obvious. It says EX. That stands for exhaust. You want to check, make sure that you don't have any wear on your cam lobes, and where it sits in the journals. So this cam looks good. Now you look on the face and you will see we've got a 1, 2, and a 3. Now the exhaust side, you want the little arrow with the 1 to face towards the right or towards the front of the engine, and that little flat arrow, you want that to be even or parallel with the top of the mating surface of this case. So I'm going to reach in here, pull up my cam chain. You want to make sure you're still at top dead center. I'm just going to give it a couple tugs, make sure it gets in the lower gear, and we'll place this in here. See if we can get it on the first shot. Right about like that. That looks pretty good. You can see that arrow is nice and even with the top of the case. Now we're going to come in with the intake side. So this one, you can see there's no decompression system, and just like the exhaust side, it says in for intake. Really hard to mess these up. Again, you want to inspect this, make sure it's good to go. Also, you want to check your gear, make sure you don't have any broken teeth or anything. And this is going to go in. With this one, you have the 1, 2, and 3. But for the second cam or the intake side, you want it turned with the number 2 being parallel with the top of the case. So it'll go just like this. So we'll take this, lift up our cam chain, and just like with the other side, see if we can get that number 2 good and lined up straight out of the gate. I think we need to roll it just a little bit. Okay, right like that looks pretty good. You can see that arrow looks pretty much flush, and this one is still nice and flush. The OEM service manual has a really nice diagram of the orientation of those cams and how they go. That can really help. So if you don't have this manual, you can take a screenshot of this, and you'll notice up here where it says 1st pin and 15th pin, that's a secondary way to make sure that we have the cam gears on the right link in the chain. We're going to check that right now. So we're still at top dead center. We've got both of our arrows still nice and even. And what we're going to do, this number 2 points to this pin right here on the cam chain. And then this number 3 points to this pin over here on the chain. And we want this one to be the 1st pin, and this one should be the 15th when we count over to there. So we'll start here. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So we're good to go. Easy way to check it. Now put the cam covers in place. These are really easy to identify. You can see they have intake and exhaust right on them, so you can't mess it up. Now, before you put these on, you want to put a little bit of lubricant in here and on top of the cams. I've already got oil on mine. Before those go on, there are 4 dowel pins. I've already put a little bit of anti-seize on these. We've got one that goes here, one that goes here. Pop those in place, and then in the back we've got one that goes here and another one goes right here. Start with the intake side, and that will go this way. Once the dowel pins are in there, they can't go in the wrong orientation because they won't fit. Then we've got the exhaust side. Get that over top of our dowels. All of these are going to be the same length bolt with the exception of these 2. These ones are a little bit taller. Populate all of these. And then in the middle, there is this cam chain slider. That is going to go right here. And then we will pop our bolts through, one short one, one long one. I'm going to buzz these in with the impact gun. Not going to tighten them, just running them in. Then these will get tightened to 7 foot-pounds of torque. Now that these are torqued down, this is when you want to come in and double check your work. Make sure that your valve clearances are good. I already came in and double checked mine, and mine all check out. It's really common that you're going to have to pop these back off and readjust it. I've gotten really good at doing the method without actually having the caps on, but definitely now is when you want to check them. Make sure that you're still at top dead center and just run your feeler gauge under. Make sure that everything is in spec. Now that the timing is set, we can put our plugs back in. Both of these get anti-seize because they are notorious for getting stuck. This top one will get torqued to 15 foot-pounds, and this big one on the side I just snug by hand. Good. Man, we are close to putting that titanium blue cover on. I am super excited for that. Before we do that, we've got a new cam chain tensioner. This is a brand new OEM, came right from Partzilla.com. They do make aftermarket ones as well. They're a lot more inexpensive, but as always, OEM is typically going to be the best option. So we're going to pull this spring out. That just threads loose. And on the back side, you can see there is a plunger. And what you do is pull back on this little latch, and it'll drop the plunger all the way in. That's where you want it. You want to put it all the way in. Got a brand new gasket we're going to put on here. Just going to grease it up, and I will just stick that in place. The grease should hold it. There we go. Now we're going to place this in here. As you can see, it says up on the top. Makes it pretty easy to do it the right way. And before I put it in, I'm going to put a little bit of assembly lube on the end of our plunger. Go ahead and put this in here. And we've got 2 Allen head bolts. I've got a little bit of anti-seize on both of them. Thread these in place. These will get torqued to 7 foot-pounds. Then we've got a spring that goes in here, and our bolt. And the bolt has a hole in the back that the spring fits into, and a crush washer. And I did put a little bit of anti-seize on here. If you've noticed, I put anti-seize on a lot of things. Now when you push on this, you'll probably hear some clicking, and that's the plunger auto-adjusting to put tension on the cam chain slider. And we'll get this threaded in there. There's a little bit of tension on it. It can be a little tricky, but it's not too bad. We're going to tighten this to 21.5 foot-pounds. Alrighty. Oh man, we are close. We are going to put our gasket in place for the cam cover. The service manual wants to run a little bit of the gasket sealer just in these 2 little half moons. So we're going to use the Suzuki 1207B. You could also use Yamabond or any equivalent gasket sealer. I'm not going to put very much, just a little bit. And we'll dab it in there on both of them. To be honest, I'm not even really sure that you need this, but the service manual does call for it, so we'll put it in there. We'll just give it a couple dabs. That kind of gives it a little bit of body. And here's the gasket. This is an OEM right from Suzuki, brand new. You can get a Tusk or an other aftermarket equivalent. Any one of them is going to work just fine. I'm going to put some grease on this because when I took the one that came off from the 2003, it was super stuck on there. So I'm going to put grease on this. I'm just not going to put grease in this area where it'll be contacting the sealant, and that should, help a little bit for when this does have to come off, which probably will be somewhat soon because it's very typical on a new build that you'll have to go in and readjust your valves, or the shims. So good idea to make this so that it won't get stuck on there. Now we'll take our cover, go to the underside, and press this into the grooves. It has like a channel that it fits into. And we'll drop this in place. Oh man, this is gonna look awesome. I'm gonna come up top and we've got these rubber washers that are gonna go in either one of these. I believe there is no orientation for these. These can go up or down. We're gonna put some grease on these. Stick them in place. And there's a different style washer that's going to go in the back. It has like a shoulder on it. I've got some grease on here as well. Put that in place. And we've got these flat Allen bolts with a shoulder on the bottom. Got a little anti-seize on there. We're going to get 1 in the front, 2 in the front, and this third one with a real long shoulder goes in the back. I'll snug these down by hand. And these get torqued in a series. First you go to 7 foot-pounds. And then 10 foot-pounds. And of course you can't forget your brand new genuine Suzuki OEM spark plug. Now I'm not going to install mine right now, but if you are going to install your plug, the spark plug end gap is 0.7 to 0.8 millimeters, and the tightening torque is pretty light on these. They go to 8 foot-pounds. Short of that, my friend, you've just built yourself a Z400 engine. Thanks for making it this far into the video. If there's one final thing I can leave you with, it's to take your time in your engine build. A lot of times when you're watching these videos, it can seem really easy, and when you're doing it on your own, it can be a complete struggle. Just take your time, refer to the service manual, and go back and rewatch portions of this video that you need to, and you will be able to get the job done. If something isn't fitting right and you're getting frustrated, it might be time to take a break and then come back to it. If you enjoyed the video in any way, shape, or form, or it helped you out, please consider giving the video a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. I put a lot of work into these videos, and hitting the like button helps me out tremendously. If you're interested in seeing the restoration of this quad from start to finish, make sure to check out the series. It's a really good one. All right, guys, thanks again for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.